Continuing through Deuteronomy chapter 18, of course, last week we commenced with the opening 8 verses of the chapter where we're looking specifically at Moses' commands here to the ancient Israelites regarding the Levitical priesthood under the Mosaic covenant, and did a good job of being able to see how in the New Testament that comes into its ultimate vision and fulfillment in that of the royal priesthood that those like Isaiah and others spoke of, the priesthood of all the believers, that we are indeed a nation who now communes with God through our Redeemer and Mediator, Jesus Christ, the high priest in the order of not Aaron, but Melchizedek. Today's passage bridges really what we saw last week and what we'll then see throughout the remainder of this chapter, okay, from verse 15 onward, which will be concerning the prophets, okay, and God raising up prophets to communicate and reveal his divine truth unto the people. It's a very similar circumstance to what we've already faced a couple of chapters ago, especially last chapter, in relation to this middle section of the Deuteronomic Code here. Okay? To remind you, as I did last week, we began at the end of chapter 16, particularly verses 18 to 20, with the establishment and the commands concerning judges and officers of the state, okay, magistrates, we might otherwise say, officials who would govern the king's will and his commands. The latter portion of which was spoken of, referring to that very same king, the law of the king, we spent many weeks going through in the end of chapter 17. But in the middle of that, namely the beginning of chapter 17, was a almost interlude section on specifically the judgment of idolatry that served to bridge the gap between the commands of the judges and the command of the king. This section is following that similar or that format in that regard, right? Bridging between what we saw last week concerning the church setting, the Levitical priesthood, and then also what continues on in this ecclesiastical side of this subsection, the prophets as well. And what we have here is a series, a litany, given in rapid fire, not an exhaustive list by any means. None of the lists, generally speaking, here are meant to be exhaustive. They are shorthand references to things that are being highlighted by the prophet Moses that are given to us concerning all manner of idolatries, I suppose we would say plural, okay, that give us perhaps a very on-the-nose, very obvious example of why it is so vitally important to not only see the words in the context in which they are given, which of course is most important and pertinent, but also to see the deeper spiritual matters of the law. We've often spoken many times in regard to the scriptures in general between what in Christian terms we usually refer to as the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, not as competitors, but rather as dual layers of the same element, okay? What is said on the surface, which is absolutely true, and then the deeper theological or spiritual or philosophical intent behind that undergirds and propagates why the thing is what it is. In more elementary terms, we can think of them as the what, right, the letter of the law, and the why, okay, the spirit of the law. This passage is one such example, perhaps even an exemplar in almost anything that we have actually seen thus far in Deuteronomy of that particular dynamic, of where we could, in our own era, confine our reading to the letter of the law, to the what, and then assume ourselves to be in consummate correlation and perfection to this particular standard. Right? Even if we just gaze our eyes ever so quickly through the opening verses, okay? When you enter the land in which the Lord your God shall give you, says Moses, you shall not learn to imitate the abominations of those nations. Okay? The strongest word that is used of evil in Scripture, okay? Abominations. We encountered it once before and going to encounter it again here in multiple forms. And he then describes the kinds of abominations that he has in mind. Verse 10, there shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire, one who uses divination, one who practices soothsaying, in other words, fortune-telling, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, right? A witch or a warlock, or one who is an enchanter or a medium or a spiritist, or who inquires of the dead, i.e. necromancy. We could, hypothetically, and perhaps to some wishes, save ourselves inordinate amounts of time by merely pondering across the next 60 seconds as to whether any of us at this current time are engaged in one of the following activities. Sacrificing your newborn babies to bronze and effigies of Moloch, engaging in fortune-telling, tarot card reading, crystal ball searching, palm reading, tea leaf reading, etc., in order to divine the future. Witchcraft of various different forms in all of its imaginative aspects, as well as necromancy, consulting the dead. Is there anyone who's currently practicing those things? Secretly, unbeknownst to myself and Pastor Michael? No? Well, a round of applause for us all. Let us now join together and partake of Holy Communion. That would be the nice way of doing the sermon. Done. Finito. The end. None of us are doing these things, so I guess we can all just bypass more or less anything else it has to say. Alas, the reason why these examples are so powerful and so prolific in regard to what they communicate spiritually, even from the Old Testament, is because not only, and I don't want to be hyperbolic, but in fact I don't know if I can be hyperbolic in this particular instance, not only is this passage just relevant to us in some broad or generic sense, there are few passages that we have encountered thus far in Deuteronomy which are more relevant to us. When I say to us, I don't just mean us as people generally. I mean us particularly, us specifically, us in our own particular time and context. For that precise dynamic that I alluded to just moments ago, namely the what and the why, the letter of the law, the what, so things like spiritism, mediumship, necromancy, child sacrifices to Baal, etc., versus the why, that undergird and actually give the reasoning behind why these things in these ancient contexts here, specifically as acts or activities, were wrong. Because it is that very defining principle, which is what we're ultimately talking about here, the principle that undergirds the law, that is perpetually relevant. The things and the reasons as to why necromancy is evil, and to why witchcraft is evil, and to why sorcery, and to why divination, and to why child sacrifice, so on, has not ceased to be evil or wrong or corrupt or wicked by virtue of the cessation and the fulfillment of the Mosaic covenant. These things are fundamentally evil then, 3,500 years ago, as they are now, in the most prima facie sense. So anyone who does attempt to practice these things today, of which there are people here in our own community in the Blue Mountains who do, okay, to one degree or another, are of course violating the obvious surface level command here. Yet it is that deeper principle behind each one of these things that are so replete among our modern world that many of us are wholly, WHO, and entirely unaware of them. They have become the air that we breathe. They have become the water that we drink. They have become the food that we eat. They have become everything that we consume. We have the same requisite ability to recognize these things around us as does a fish conceptualizing its own existence in the great body of water in which it swims. It has no meaningful knowledge of anything else outside or beyond that, in ways that are truly satanic. If we remember, of course, that one of the primary and elemental archetypes of he who is known as the Satan is that of the deceiver. It is the deceptive element of conniving and convincing people, either individually or collectively, against the will of God, against the law of God, against that which is good and righteous and true and beautiful in the world, and replacing it with that which ultimately we could accurately describe as counterfeit in one form or another. Okay? It is the essence of what the Apostle John refers to as antichristos, right, in the place of Christ. It is that very sense that I'm speaking of, because when applied by analogy directly to things that are foundational and fundamental, not peripheral, not kind of weird and wacky off in the fringes, not at the extremes of whatever you happen to be talking about, central, foundational to the very nature and function and structure of the modern world, and particularly of modern Western nations specifically is what I'm referring to ultimately, including our own, are the very evils that undergird the principles, these particular practices. And much of our focus is actually going to be explaining what on earth I'm referring to. Okay? This is not the first time I've done this passage. I've done this passage before elsewhere. Okay? And the same enlightenment that came upon that place was hopefully what we shall have before us today. Okay? In the realization of what I'm actually referring to. Okay? Ultimately, we need to understand something first and foremost about why these particular practices that are listed ultimately for us in verses 10 and 11 directly, the shorthand list, why they are in fact evil. We, of course, generally speaking, know as Christians that this is among the list of things to not do, but the fundamental principles behind why these things are evil are essential for us to understand, even in relation to those things, let alone any other application. Okay? Fundamentally, what I'm just going to broadly refer to here as witchcraft does have specific definitions. There are varying forms of witchcraft depending on what you're talking about, where you're talking about, when you're talking about, right? But the general practices of witchcraft or of divination, okay, to divine the future, in other words, to gain via illicit means knowledge of the future, particularly what's being spoken of here, is a fundamentally evil thing. In one form or another, all of these practices, right, can be defined by their common objective, namely, in shorthand, to gerrymander the future. Okay? To take control over both the elemental principles of the world, be they material or spiritual or both, okay, in various different forms that I mentioned earlier, in order to control future outcomes. Every form of mysticism, every form of witchcraft in general, in one form or another, or any other such term that can be applied at the more specific level, is attempting to garner or to attract or to just otherwise actually achieve that objective. Okay? Really, really obvious examples of that, like going and seeing a fortune teller who will rob you blind of your money, is the whole attempt to try and garner some kind of certainty about the future outcome of something in general, like your life, or of some particular action, right? Something you're wanting to undertake. Okay? Think tarot cards. Think the reading of tea leaves. Think palm reading. Think all the various different practices that have gone on around the world, both in ancient times, ancient and modern. Okay? It is attempting to garner knowledge and concrete prediction of the future, fundamentally. That explanation hopefully can start to open up and bring to fruition the reasoning as to why this finds itself in this particular part of Deuteronomy. Okay? Because what is this sandwich between? What did we see last week? The priesthood, right? So the church, right, specifically, and the prophets. So both of them ecclesiastical. They're both church-related. The servants of God and the mouthpieces of God. Okay? Ultimately, both of whom are doing what? Revealing God. They are revealing the knowledge of God. It's what the prophets in the Old Testament did. It is what the great prophet, the final prophet, right? The capital P prophet, the Word made flesh, revealing God, right? We'll talk more about that next week. Did and does and continues to do, right? Through his word. It's revelation. It is knowledge. It is placing trust in God. Because ultimately the reason why they are not to engage in these abominations is because where should they seek their knowledge? God. Where should their confidence lie for things in regard to ongoing future endeavours, personally, corporately as the nation, tribally, whatever else? God. Whose word should they trust? The words of witches and of spiritists and mediums? No. The word of God, given through, in this case here, Moses in these days. Right? Okay. Revelation, knowledge, the future, all the nexus of all of these things, that's what's pertinent here. Okay? That is fundamentally why these practices are evil. And it is something that's not just contained or confined to this historical context here, back in the mid-2nd millennium BC. It is something which goes all the way back to primordial times. The first instance of quasi-divination, in fact not even really quasi at that point, you have in Genesis 3. This first element of occultism, right? Hidden, secret knowledge, and man's procurement of it by illicit means. Is that ringing any bells? Right? Genesis 3. The serpent, the soothsayer, literally, whispering sweet nothings unto Eve, convincing her that if she takes of this fruit, she shall surely not die. Is that really what God said? Is that really going to be the outcome for the future? Or are you able to access this secret, esoteric, occultic, right, hidden, secret knowledge and have a different outcome, to create a different outcome for the future? Divination, witchcraft, this kind of occultism is born in the Garden of Eden. It is born in Genesis 3. The whole thing is one gigantic exercise in occultism. Secret, esoteric knowledge forbidden to man by those means. Right? That man then procured for himself, for ourselves, by illicit means, right? Illicit, illegal, right? Evil means. Occultism. Every one of these practices is descended from the exact same concept and practice. It is using various different means to control the elemental world around you, like I said, materially or spiritually or both, to garner control of the future, not through trust and faith and confidence in God, not through obedience to God and his precepts, but by other means. No matter how virtuous or righteous we think those things to be, no matter what excuses we create for ourselves, no matter how much we play that up in various other terminologies and language to assuage ourselves, the dynamic is still there. That's fundamentally why these practices are evil. Okay? Having a cup of tea and then looking at the leaves afterwards is a fairly mundane task by all comparative standards. Okay? Using that concept or that practice to somehow influence, manipulate, and or determine, either or, the future outcomes of a person's life, of some activity, of a particular goal or objective or a plan, a project, whatever, is precisely that dynamic of occultic knowledge, of receiving truth and knowledge and revelation by means outside or apart from God. Of course, ultimately in many ways involving spirits. Now, the difference in the ancient world here is that there was no veneer that anything other than that was going on in a generalized sense. Okay? If you wanted to actually have this divination take place, you would need to go to temples with overtly religious figures and priests, right? With oracles, who were these superhuman-like figures, right? You had to go out into the woods and meet with some hag in a hut somewhere, right? This is what you had to do. People who were very obviously and evidently of this way of life and of this practice. It wasn't this clean, nice, put-together method of doing things. It was very overtly religious, and no one was under the impression that it was something to the contrary of that. It was obviously and manifestly religious, and of course totally part of the normal way of doing things, right? Utterly accepted culturally across the cultures of the world, but no one was under any pretense that this was something other than broadly described religious activities. Our biggest dilemma, and this is very important for you to hear, our biggest dilemma today, when I say our, I mean us today, our biggest dilemma is the fact that we are doing all of these things under an entirely different conceptualization and banner. All of these things have been demythologized, have been despiritualized, have been, to just use a more generic term, secularized to deceive, manipulate, and convince you, to convince us all, to deceive us all, that the way that we do these things are actually totally, quote-unquote, kosher, and they're totally normal, and nothing religious or spiritual is going on at all, when in fact that's exactly what's going on. We do this across, as I mentioned earlier, so many sectors of our society that we often can't even see it. It's just everywhere. Hence why I need to do what I now will do, which is show you and explain to you precisely what I'm talking about. We could start almost anywhere, figuratively speaking. We could actually pick up on almost any particular aspect of society we wanted to, but I'm only going to confine it to ones that are the most obvious and the most observable when you slow down, think, and apply what these scriptures are saying to then see this. It will be abundantly easy to fall into the trap that this is drawing a long bow, that this is a stretch, that that's not really what's going on, which would itself only serve to prove precisely the broader point that I am making, which is just how utterly common these things have become, to the point that we can hardly see it, just as with the nose on our own faces. But upon deeper analysis, hopefully, if anything is achieved today, you will come to realize what many of us have been saying for years. That would be the objective. And how we can then think in response to that, and more importantly then, live and act and behave in response to those kinds of things that I'm talking about. Okay? That's hopefully the objective. One of the most obvious ways in which we engage in these practices, again there are many, would be in relation to economics. When we speak of things like the market, we speak of the market as if it were a deity unto itself, as if it has this active, living omniscience, omnipotence, and sovereign intellect, as if it itself is a form of providence. Any given night you will hear some economist, worth a cent or not, opining about the market says blah, 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 blah. The market demands this and this. The market rewards this. The market punishes that. The market demands that we make this sacrifice, that we as a nation turn this. Here's what the market wills. All these terms, these verbs and these adjectives are used to describe these concepts, especially at the macroeconomic level. We talk about markets as if they are an omniscience, as if they are a providence, as if they are an intelligence that act as a spiritual force upon our lives. It is giving this kind of knowledge ascribed and attributed to markets, to macroeconomic forces of supply and demand, right? The kind of classical invisible hand for those who understand economic theory, that then control and determine our lives in a way that is nigh indistinguishable from how any of the ancients thought about how the gods impact our lives. Whenever the discussions regarding economics comes forth, is there even a scintilla of a hint in any of the verbiage or language that we ever hear that God has any control over the economy of this country? No. It's literally a non-factor. The economy, at the broadest sense, markets in their somewhat more specific sense, are treated as omniscient, omnipotent forces that will control and dictate how our life will turn out over the course of the next quarter or the next financial year or the next insert whatever period. We are talking about those things, we are conceptualizing those things, and then behaving toward those things, more where the rubber hits the road, in the ways that the ancient pagans did in relation to the gods. By having that primary dynamic, when it comes to those practices, what do we then do? We do all kinds of things that, again, are indistinguishable principally from ancient pagan practices. They are distinguishable formally, so in other words, literally the form in which they take, but they are indistinguishable in regard to the principle. All kinds of things. When we come to practices, so many of the consumer practices are utterly determined by what will appease the market, what will control the market, what will satisfy the demands of the market. How will we invest our money into various things along environmental and social and governance metrics? How will we invest finances in regard to scores concerning diversity and equity and inclusion? What consumer practices will we thrust upon people in order to make sure that they assuage various kinds of sins, quote unquote, against the market? If we deem, of course, that the market dictates and demands that we are producing too much carbon in our carbon footprint per person, we need to then undertake penitential-like actions. We need to make sure to reduce our carbon footprint, a dynamic utterly indistinguishable from reducing your karmic debt, from reducing sins, anything, all the way down to utterly superstitious practices which upon 5 minutes of examination bring you to the obvious conclusion that it does not do a thing to fix anything, but yet we do it like religious automatons. That you must, as a consumer, assuage your debt against the market by making sure you use paper straws at McDonald's. And that is how you will absolve yourself of any kind of environmental damage that you're doing, by drinking not from a plastic straw but from a paper straw out of a cup that's using a plastic lid. How on earth can that be defined as different from everything that we look down upon the ancients for doing? Oh, utterly superstitious people. They believed that this little totem that they had been given by the temple priests, that if they just held that that would somehow save them, that would be something that would assuage their guilt, that if they went and they used this specific item, that would make them morally good and virtuous. We believe that if you use recycling practices, no matter where that recycling ends up going, newsflash, it's still the ocean, that is how you maintain your moral standards. We do this across all kinds of things. Even the way that we judge the efficacy of our atoning and assuaging of the demands of the market. How do we, in modern Western nations, including Australia, conceptualise, or at least I should say more accurately, analyse and deduce whether or not things are going well, whether or not we are blessed as a nation? There's a very specific answer to that. GDP. Right, some of you are already muttering it. Good job. GDP. Gross domestic product. We get to the end of the financial year and we all stand around and watch number on graph go up and conclude we're good. We're on the right track. We're doing the right thing because magic number on graph go up forever. That's what we do. We measure truth. We measure value of not just things in general, but of human beings by price indexes, by stock indices, by all manner of things, by the interest rates given by the central bank of insert country, in our case Reserve Bank of Australia. All of these things, these are the metrics by which we determine, are we good? Are we doing what is right? None of which are influenced or governed at all in a way that we behave, believe and practice by God. They are utterly atheistic means of determining these things, but yet in the great irony of the modern world, because atheism ultimately is simply the belief in nothing, atheism taken to its logical conclusion is just nihilism. Nothing is meaningfully true, nothing really exists, and nothing has any purpose. Which is why every serious, famous atheist has ended in depression, suicide, or just utter madness. Right? Like a Friedrich Nietzsche, for example. It's replaced by something that human beings actually do need, which is spiritual means and matters. And so we are conducting those same practices along those same lines. Even as I mentioned, they're one particular category, like the interest rates of the central bank. There is perhaps no greater economic example of absolute and utter spiritual superstition than central banking. Whenever anyone in charge of the central banks utters anything out into the ether, it is analysed by every man and their dog to discern what on earth this could possibly mean, and entire markets can get flipped in a day, internationally, by the most generic and vague of statements from any one of these functional oracles. The augury that takes place any time a central bank announces something regarding interest rates, they don't even have to change it. The entire nation comes to a standstill, waiting on a knife's edge with bated breath to see what will be said. And we're waiting, and we get news updates, live breaking news, telling us that they're still in the meeting as if we're sitting around for a papal conclave. All for then the high priest to walk out and tell us that after lengthy consideration, after consulting all of the spirits, I mean the spreadsheets and the graphs, we have determined the interest rate shall stay exactly where it is. The magic number won't change. Or something really world-altering and cataclysmic, like the magical number changing by 0.05%. We treat this entire institution and these people and the system in a way that is exactly the same way that the ancient pagans determined who would be king, whether we would go to war, what kind of economic investments we would make, right? I mentioned a word earlier, augury. Augury is the practice, by the way. It's a form of this kind of thing, spiritism, right, divination, of consulting birds. In the case of the Romans, the high priest, the augur, would send out an eagle and determine from the flight patterns of the eagle as to whether or not we were going to war in Gaul this year. You would consult the entrails of the sacrificed bird. Right? You would take a chicken, sacrifice it in the temple, and the augur would then divine the pattern of the intestines to determine whether or not this person should be selected to the Senate and whether or not the gods approved of what the Senate was currently doing. All of these things, this kind of looking unto this authority for all of these little means and metrics to determine future outcomes. What we do is indistinguishable from any of those things. Before I continue, there's an important point to make here. It is important that you hear this. What I'm very clearly not talking about is things actually grounded concretely in reality, things like conducting a study, things like analysing data, things like learning from that data, making interpolations of that data, assessments, interpretations, and arriving at normal, generic, scientific conclusions regarding information. We're not talking about that. We're talking about systems, processes, practices that are used as if they are spiritual entities unto themselves in order to influence, control, and or determine with certainty future outcomes. That is what these things fundamentally are, especially if you're talking about economics. That's not the only one we're going to talk about here. At the broadest level of economics, no one has a blue's clue what's going on. You have never met more highfalutin, self-important aggrandizers than those who deal in the matter of macroeconomics. Anyone with any financial economic background knows exactly what I'm talking about. It is a whole host of, we think maybe possibly, that this is what's going to happen, that's then presented as if it were concrete reality that will determine the fate of whole nations, that will determine whether or not someone ends up in utter destitution or not, that will determine whether or not you have any ability to make meaningful income in the world. All these kinds of things, they're not abstract ideas that only have abstract consequences. No, they have very real, concrete, on-the-ground consequences because of this modern secular divination. That is what is going on. It's not just complaining and railing against ideas out there. It's things which are deeply impacting us at foundational levels. Across, as I said, so many areas of society. In regard to that whole concept of determinations of futures, we do this in politics. The parties become their own religions. They have their own dogmas. They have their own doctrines. They have their own priesthood, which in other words is the controlling faction. They have their own heroes, their saints, right? Famous figures from that party who are hailed as the gold standard. They have their own martyrs who fall on their sword politically. They have all these kinds of things. They have their own feast days. That's all the secularized days for this week and that day and this month that have entirely replaced all the previously Christian elements. The leader is a quasi-messianic figure until, of course, they become slightly politically inconvenient, in which they get backstabbed and then chucked out just like Julius Caesar was. and replaced by the next stooge. They have all kinds of theology that determine not only what they currently believe, but also how they will behave in the future. Election promises, campaign promises, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to do it, none of which, of course, ever come true, but alas, is the same kind of divining of the future that we're herein referring to, even within the broader context of the society or the system in which it's operating, where democracy is treated as a sacred system, where the will of the people, real or not, is treated as moral righteousness. It is the standard. That this must be true. This is definitely the party, the people, that should be in power because more people said they should than people who didn't say they should. As if we as Christians have ever believed the truth is determined by consensus. Do we believe that truth is determined by majority vote? I hope not. The Old Testament prophets might want to have a word with you if you think that it is. It's never been determined by majority consensus. So then why do we behave as if morally these things occur and are good and righteous and true by majority consent? Because of the same exact pagan superstitions that are playing out in Deuteronomy 18. The truth can be altered. The truth can be determined by human means, ritualistic elements, like the ritual of, instead of making a sacrifice at a temple, going into a temple of democracy. In other words, your local primary school library, and casting your ballot. This is the part where I mentioned earlier that it's important to remember that the temptation is to go, oh, well, that's not what really is going on. That's a stretch. Well, it's not. It's an analogue for the actual thing. Because like I said to you, the outward prima facie practice changes, which is exactly what that is, right? But the underlying spiritual principle is the same. It's the same thought process. It's the same belief behind it. The what may change, but the why remains the same. At its core, at its foundation. We do this on other areas. We do this in regard, especially something pertinent up here, in relation to environmentalism. In fact, there are very few areas that are much akin to exactly what's going on in Deuteronomy 18 than modern environmentalism. Now, Christians have always taught, rightfully so, what we would generally maybe today call conservation, that no, God's creation is good, we should care for it, we should not destroy it, we should not use it brazenly or wantonly, we should not just use it haphazardly, we should not just mow down 50,000 acres of perfectly good forest land and put in some monstrosity of an AI data center, right? We shouldn't just dump our rubbish in rivers, we shouldn't just splurge rubbish into the oceans. All those things are eminently Christian positions. But we treat these as entirely religious. How often is Mother Earth language used in relation to modern environmentalism? All the time. That is just quite literally the ancient deity of, among her various known names, Gaia among the Greeks, for example. Right? The Earth Mother being foundational to the very concept of ancient cosmology. It's the same language that we use. I mentioned some of these things earlier, like purity rituals. How do you purify yourself spiritually in relation to wrongdoings, i.e. carbon production, in the environment? Well, you offset your carbon footprint, you purify yourself through all of these little things like I was highlighting earlier about things like plastic or paper straws, or things like recycling your rubbish, or things like using the right kind of bag when you go to Coles. These are all purity rituals that, again, are the exact same tiny, insignificant, superstitious practices that all the ancients did, that we moderns with iPhones look down upon them for. The principle is the same. But because we've cloaked it in modern technological scientific progress, we have deluded ourselves into believing that it's actually a perfectly normal, natural thing to do. That it's to use a more operative word in this case, rational. That's a rational thing to do. Yet even when taken to its extremes, we end up in, observably, much more overtly evil places. The whole concept that is contained within modern environmentalism, right, as a cult, as a religion, is this concept of Malthusian sacrifice. In other words, the world is overpopulated, there's too many people, we need less people, we need to cut down. And so then policies which economically suppress people, which lead to worse economic outcomes, which lead to people dying, combined with practices that actually just at simultaneous moments promote the economic, or in this case I should say perhaps, population decline of a people, like contraception, like abortion, like limited children, if not no children. All this is swimming in the same direction in the same river. They're not separate, they're not accidental, they're definitely not coincidental. They are all together taken for the exact same system, promoting the same ideas. And speaking of that concept of something like abortion, we've preached on this before, hence why I'm not really touching on it here, the most direct and obvious analogue to child sacrifice, because it's not even really an analogue, it's just actually the thing. It's actually just child sacrifice for precisely the same reason. The reason you sacrificed a child to Moloch 3,000 years ago was in order to ensure your own personal economic prosperity and potentiality in the future. It's the same reason. I can't have this child because I have my whole career ahead of me. Future economic prosperity and potentiality. It's the same thing. It is why almost all abortions are just elective. They're not even for the scapegoat reason of sexual assault, which happens hardly ever, even still not justifying the murder of the child. Whole different subject. That's why that's done. For future economic gain. It doesn't mean that you can't be forgiven. Of course you can be forgiven for this. Right? Let's not forget that. But the point that I'm making about it is that it is identical. There's almost no veneer in relation to that. It's all for, again, as I said earlier, cloaked in this modern scientific terminology. We've become well acquainted with this, which is why when I speak about this, my tolerance level for any kind of accusation of, oh, this is nonsense, this is rubbish, is paper thin at this point. Because we've all been given the most vivid demonstration of this 5 years ago. This is precisely the dynamic that happened during COVID. As soon as this descended upon us, by means that at the time were alleged to be unknown, which now have been completely and universally admitted by the United States government to have been caused by their own biolabs in Wuhan, the entire world sat at the edge of their seat waiting until the modern priests, i.e. experts, came forth and told us the truth about everything and how our lives would be determined and controlled over the coming weeks and months. All the various little rituals that you can do, like cleaning your hands 20 times for no reason whatsoever. All the various sacred amulets that you could hold on to protect yourself, like the cloth mask on your face. All the various practices that would wave that would kind of keep evil spirits at bay, like staying 1.5 meters away from someone. It's the same stuff. It's the same thing. Cloaked in modern, atheistic, rationalist, secular language, that undergirding it all is the same pagan superstition. Sacred amulet, face mask. Protective elixir, vaccine. Staving off evil spirits, no contact. All these things. They're all the same principle, including even just the way that they're communicated. Again, talking about controlling the future. Right? That if you listen to the experts, the only way we'll get out of this is if we listen to the experts, is if we obey their words exactly, is the same principle fundamentally as listen to the priesthood of the Roman temple. Listen to the augurs. If we violate the words of the augurs, of the oracle, in any way, the gods will descend a curse upon us. No matter how ridiculous the thing being said is, no matter how contrary to all known knowledge and truth it actually is, no matter how much it completely contradicts everything we've known about insert specific thing up until 5 minutes ago, believe the experts, to the point where even to question those experts, many of whom experts equaled government bureaucrat for 20 years, that fact aside, to even question the experts was treated quite literally as blasphemy. To violate the words, the commands, the precepts of the omniscient experts resulted in you being imprisoned, resulted in you being fined inordinate thousands of dollars, resulted in criminal prosecution for violating the sacred words of the modern techno-priesthood. In their religious vestments, white garments, lab coats, the whole thing is there, staring you in the face if you have the spiritual eyes to see and the ears to hear. This is all the same thing. Before we come, perhaps, most obviously to one of the biggest things that we do. It's kind of been undergirding all of these elements, right? Because it's the thing that really propagates much of this. It's the one thing I have not yet mentioned. It's the final thing. Technology itself. Technology itself. We treat across all manner of things, all the various sections, economics, politics, education, environment, all manner of things, and their various subclades for that matter, as if the algorithms, the models, the systems digitally that are built are oracular in their own right. Right? Oracular, in other words, prophetic. That they are oracles that profess forth sacred truth. That the word of those algorithms, the word of those digital systems, of those models, is sacrosanct, is omniscient. Apply this to any area you want. Right? Let's use one, say the environment. Can we use any one of them? I can go back 100 years and show you news articles from the 1920s talking of an impending global warming catastrophe. I can fast forward, even within the same media institution, or I can pull you a headline from the New York Times, for example, in 1958, saying that we only have a handful of years to solve global warming, otherwise we're doomed, all to then turn around not even 2 years later in 1960 and start talking about how the scientists have confirmed an impending ice age is going to be upon us. And then we spend 20 years talking about the impending ice age and the return of the woolly mammoth making a comeback tour, all to then turn around and flip-flop and go the complete opposite direction once again, back to, we have 10 years. If we don't solve this, all these islands will be underwater by 2000, none of which happened. If we don't act, we have 5 years until the polar ice caps are melted. They didn't melt. We have 3 years left. We have 10 years left. We get to that 10-year mark and say we have 10 years left again. All these things. Because the modelling shows, models from the same people who can't accurately tell me whether or not it's going to rain in 2 days' time, but can tell me whether or not the apocalypse will descend upon us in 10 years. All of that practice is the exact same thing. The priests would have said, they consulted the oracles, they searched the pattern in the stars, and it turns out that war is going to be upon us in next year. No difference. None. Zero. Nada. Nil. The same thing. Deeply religious, fundamentally spiritual superstition, born of divining the future, to control it, to influence it, to manipulate it. Algorithms, models, technological digital systems, all of these things is the same practice. They used sticks and dye and chickens. We use ones and zeros on a computer screen. We use spreadsheets. We use AI-generated and powered algorithms. It's the same nonsense, just by different means. All of this contained within this particular concept that gives us this image of precisely what the modern technological world does. Attempts to determine the future by means, and control it therefore, outside of God. That is what is ultimately being called an abomination. When God says, to remind you of the very specific wording back from what we had in chapter 18, you shall not learn to imitate the abominations of the nations. That is what he's referring to. All of these particular religious/spiritual practices, no matter what they contextually are on the surface, so in other words, no matter what the mean or the method is, the underlying desire, the principle, the why behind the what, is the abomination. It's an abomination before God. Because ultimately they do not trust in God. Hence why he finishes in saying, verses 13 and 14, you shall be blameless before the Lord your God. Some of your translations might also rightly say perfected. You shall be complete before God. All these things are synonymous in English. You shall be complete. In other words, you shall have everything you need before God. You don't need these things. You don't need the diviners, you don't need the witches, you don't need the spiritists, you don't need the mediums, you don't need the child sacrifices, you don't need the priests who do all the magic rah-rah. You don't need that. None of that's necessary. The sacrifice of that. You need God. Because God is the actual one who holds and bears providence over the world. He is the one who is sovereign over the affairs of all things. There is nothing rogue in the world. There is nothing beyond or outside of his control. He is not powerless in the face of anything. He is the King of Kings. He is the Lord of Lords. He is all-knowing and all-powerful over all things. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the one who was, the one who is, and the one who is to come. He is the one who declares the end from the beginning and the beginning from the end. Trust in him.